The Bob Murphy Show, episode 145.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. My guest for this episode is Michael Rectenwald. I'm going to go ahead and read some of his official bio. Dr. Michael Rectenwald is the author of 10 books, including Beyond Woke, which we cover in this episode, Google Archipelago, The Digital Gulag and the Simulation of Freedom, Springtime for Snowflakes, 19th Century British Secularism, and a few others that I will skip in this summary. Michael was a professor of liberal studies and global liberal studies at NYU from 2008 to 2019. He also taught at Duke University, North Carolina Central University, Carnegie Mellon University, and Case Western Reserve University. His scholarly and academic essays have appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, Academic Questions, Endeavor, the British Journal for the History of Science, College Composition and Communication, International Philosophical Quarterly, and a few others. He holds a PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University and a master's in English Literature from Case Western. So many of you may, in case the name rings a bell, Michael Rectenwald was at NYU when he ran a Twitter account that was called Anti-PC NYU Prof, right? So he was in the guise of an anonymous NYU professor who was decrying the rampant PC stuff going on campus. And then he was interviewed by a student newspaper and they revealed his identity with his permission and all hell broke loose. So you have probably heard him on the Tom Woods show. And then Michael also gave a lecture at the Mises Institute at one point. So I'll link to all that stuff, of course, in the show notes page. So this, again, is bobmurphyshow.com/145 to get the links. And let me just mention, so the interesting thing about Michael is at one point he was an actual Marxist and then no longer is one. And so that's what I'm doing in this episode, besides just asking him about his general work now and to recount some of the history, is to try to get his take on some of the campus activism and, you know, that like that worldview, like things that to an outsider seem to be pure contradictions. I present those to him to see, you know, is it just that we don't understand the nuances, that sort of thing, just to, at the very least, you know, to understand your opponent sort of thing, since I have somebody who used to be a true believer. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Michael Rectenwald. Well, Michael Rectenwald, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Glad to be here.
So I thought it would be good. Most of the listeners probably, if they've heard of you, they know the story of, you know, what happened to you at NYU. But if you don't mind, I'd like to start a little bit before then, back when you were a true believer. And I'm wondering, you know, what was the process? Like, were you interested in English and you went into there and then were sucked into Marxism, or was it vice versa?
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to be an English professor, and I had left the undergraduate studies in like 1983, and then I came back to graduate studies in 1993. So there was a 10-year interim during which I worked in advertising, actually. And when I came back, I noted that the field had dramatically changed. What had happened is what they call the invasion of theory. And that was critical theory, which was the Frankfurt School, postmodernist theory, cultural studies. All those things had intervened. And when I came back to it, it was a totally different animal. And, you know, I liked it, though. I found it quite engaging, to be honest. And so I got slowly drawn in through a lot of classes on critical theory and cultural studies and all these different prongs of postmodern theory.
Hey, Michael, would you mind just defining, because people like outsiders, they hear critical studies all the time. What does that phrase even mean?
Critical theory?
Yeah.
critical theory is a field, I guess, of endeavor initiated by a group of Marxist intellectuals who fled Nazi Germany in 1933, came to the United States, and they set up shop at Columbia first. And so they were Marxists, but they were neo-Marxists. That is, they had all but given up the working class, for example, as the agent of change. And so they started to look at other things, and they started to look at culture. This was a new phenomenon for Marxism, because in Marxism, culture was really an epiphenomenon. It really isn't a driving element. In fact, under Marx, there's a base superstructure model. I don't know if this is too technical, but he believes that the economy drives the culture and ideas and ideology. And so you didn't need to worry about culture, but they found that you did. And they wanted to then interrogate culture in order to see what was wrong. Why wasn't socialism spreading?
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, the Frankfurt School.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and I do want to return to this stuff, but first I do want, just for the listeners who don't know your bio, just to have you tell your. But yeah, this kind of stuff I do want to come back to in this issue of postmodernism versus Marxism and so on.
Yeah.
So so in your studies, were you being taught by Marxists? I guess that's one way of putting it.
Well, they were like Marxists or post-Marxists, and basically it was just everywhere. I mean, even people that didn't overtly avow Marxism had to grapple with it. And
can I ask you? So on that topic too, like, would they have even understood the subtleties of like Marxist theory of profit, or was it like it was more of like a?
I guess when you got into I did get into that when I studied the Frankfurt School, but also at a seminar called Marxisms. And I ended up knowing more than the professor by this point, because I knew exactly what was what the theory of labor theory of value and profit and surplus extraction and what exploitation is premised on and all that. And so by then, we did eventually get to the heart of it in some cases, but a lot of people just carried it around as a kind of underlying ethos, like socialism. Marxism, of course, there's some. It has to be dealt with, and most of the professors were more or less like, shall I say, instinctual Marxists.
Right. Okay. I mean, tell me if this is a good or a bad analogy. Like, there's a lot of public intellectuals now who would endorse democracy, even though they probably haven't read the Federalist Papers and Tocqueville and things like that. Is it someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat like that. They're reading later stuff that doesn't get into the political economy.
Right, okay.
Many of them don't know Marx's real critique of political economy and what he was arguing, and none of them would know anything, for example, about Mises. They wouldn't have a clue.
Sure.
Would never cross their lips, let alone their minds.
Okay, so at some stage in your life, did you literally think of yourself as a Marxist?
Yes, eventually.
Okay.
Eventually, I was like, when I went in, I went in there and I became like a radical, like, leftist. And then, eventually I basically became a Marxist.
Okay.
Yeah, with postmodernist inflections, we'll put it that way.
Okay, great. And then I was looking at your CV. So I'm wondering, if you look now back at, things you had published, was it like technically correct and just the Marxism was a thing in your overall worldview, or like, do you not endorse your papers?
That's a good question. My research ended up being on 19th century British science and culture. And I studied like radical English radicalism in the 19th century. And then eventually I settled into studying secularism, which grew out of English radicalism in the 19th century. So I became a secularist specialist in the end.
Yeah, I noticed that word is in a lot of the titles of your actual papers.
My academic publications are not Marxist explicitly.
Okay. Just so I know, like, does secularism in that context mean what I think of it means in everyday life?
No, it's a worldview secularism.
Okay.
it was if actually the term was actually used for the first time by George Holyoake in 1851, and it meant this notion that we will concern ourselves strictly with worldly matters in time rather than eternity, in this world rather than the next. And it wasn't explicitly atheist. It was a big tent movement to try to draw together atheist fundamentalists, atheists, and liberal theists and things like that.
Okay, great. So at some point, so we know like the punchline is going to be, you started your anonymous Twitter account, but I'm wondering, had
what
things happened earlier?
Like, I'll say that even as a Marxist, I became very annoyed and critical of this identity politics on the left.
Okay.
And I noticed that all kinds of things were being shoved down my throat. Like all of a sudden I was a cisgender hetero male. I mean, where did this come from? And it was also a term of derogation. It meant that something was wrong with me.
Right.
And in critical race studies and things like that really started to bug the hell out of me. And I broke with identity politics first. And then when I did it very publicly in an interview with the NYU student newspaper, all of the left turned against me simultaneously, including the Marxists, the identity politics, left, left liberals, all of them.
Yeah. So, and folks, remember the book we're talking about here, or that I'm drawing from, is his latest, Beyond Woke. Incidentally, just as a brief change, I had assumed that was your title that you coined, but no, they use that non-ironically.
They use that themselves, and I'm trying to sucker a few of them into buying it by accident.
Very good. Going back to your advertising days, perhaps.
That's right.
Actually, I did want to ask you, was there anything that, like, did you sort of develop a disdain for the masses and how gullible they were in advertising, and did that pave the way?
No, I wasn't disdainful of the masses. I got disdainful of the industry.
Okay.
I read about that in Springtime for Snowflakes, and I was. The funny thing is, as soon as I got rather comfortable in advertising, I sort of rose quickly in the ranks, and within 4 years, I was doing very well. And then I picked up this book in the bookstore, One Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, and it just threw a monkey wrench. I bought into it. Like everything was one dimensional. My individuality was being erased by the capitalist industrial marketplace system, blah, blah, blah. And then I started to think that I was co-opted, that I had been totally co-opted. So like I say in Springtime for Snowflakes, I'm not sure that it was like maybe some leftist meme that had been deeply implanted somehow.
Right.
And then just expressed itself.
Am I getting mixed up, or is he the guy that taught Angela Davis?
Yes, he did.
Okay, all right, so that's that. Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. So then at the NYU, because I do want to talk about how, what happened to you when you went public. But am I getting the timeline right? Because you tell a story in Beyond Woke about you were on a hiring committee.
Oh, yeah, that's before I came out. Yeah. There was some things that happened while I was having these problems with identity politics, leftism, and all that. So I was on a hiring committee, and I was the chair of the committee. And we were to hire a writer, a professor of writing who could teach both academic writing and journalism. So we had a slew of like 400, 500 applications to hire one person, which is typical in academia.
If people don't know, NYU, I mean, because I got my PhD in economics there, so they were like top, I think, 20. My joke is they were top 20 when I was there, and I left, they were top 10. But
yeah, good for you. You really did it for them.
But they, for your thing, what was it? Liberal studies? Was that your
taught in
area?
This program called Liberal Studies / Global Liberal Studies. It was kind of like a big ecumenical humanities program. It was billed like a small liberal arts college within the university.
Okay.
Yeah.
But my point for the people who don't know is NYU is a prestigious.
It's prestigious, and it's really a weird place. It's set up it's more like a federation of schools than it is like a university. They're very disparate. There's tons of overlap. It's, if you want to talk, it's inefficient. If we could put it that way.
Right.
It's bizarre.
And so I'm saying that just so the relevance of your story is even more shocking.
I mean, I'm at a top 20, 25 university.
Yeah, right.
I'm not boasting, but to get my job, I had to beat out 495 people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was real, it was not easy.
Right. So I interrupted you. So you're the positions for writing.
I had a textbook in academic writing that I published, and it was used broadly across the country. Still is. I don't know why they haven't banned it yet. So I was put on this committee as the chair, and so we got these applicants, and there was 4 members on the committee. 2 of them were very hot about this one applicant, whose letter I couldn't even read because it didn't make any sense, and it was like the prose was just dreadful. I mean, it was, first of all, it was a slapdash throwing together a bunch of catchphrases that were popular in the university, like from Paulo Freire, the radical leftist education pedagogy theorist, and it was just awful. I mean, it was just awful. So they pushed her through to the last round. And at which point the candidate wrote me an email, and it was just like I hadn't seen any emails this botched, except even worse than I would receive from a first-year student in their first exchange with me. That's how bad it was. And I said, this candidate can't write. I mean, how are we going to hire a professor for writing who can't write a sentence? And I was basically already, they presumed I was racist because the candidate was a black female. They passed over a guy that had graduated with a PhD at UCLA, actually, and he, it's a top 10 English department. He had stellar credentials, and they just passed him over. And they pushed this candidate through. And so it was just this thing where this woman attacked these other candidates purposefully during these interviews, like belligerently attacked.
So another faculty member on the hiring committee.
On the committee, yeah. She belligerently attacked these other, and I just said that was outrageous. And she got up and started swinging at me. And I left the room. That's all I could do was to leave the room.
Right.
I went to the dean's office and I said, there's a problem on this committee. I mean, I was literally swung at by this certain person. And basically I got pushed off the committee.
Yeah, because in the book you say the dean said to you, well, it's complicated.
He said it was complicated. And I said, complicated? Yeah, complicated. What he meant was, we can't do anything disciplinary to this person. Furthermore, you can't be on the committee anymore. In fact, you were chair, now you're nothing. You're off. And so they went on to hire this woman that I disputed her credentials. They hired her.
Did she just have a bachelor's? Am I remembering that correctly?
She had a PhD, but
that one did.
The thing is, like, she had taught at Rutgers, and her evaluations there were like, now, rate my professor is not official, but the thing is, it actually matches very closely the rankings in the ratings of students in official ratings. They're very close. They're almost like they're maybe a 0.1 off here and there. Hers were like ones, and lambasting her, like this is the worst professor on earth. And she made me hate writing, and I've become a worse writer. My writing is worse than it ever was, and things like that. They hired her, and that was just like one of the imbroglios that I was like, this is insane.
Well, and something else you mentioned, that generally speaking, there's this idea that there's a glut of PhDs, but you were saying for a lot of these things, it's because on the demand side they're not hiring PhDs.
A lot of the times what they're doing is they'll actually hire like people with a BA degree over a PhD. So this so-called glut of PhDs, it's not about the overproduction. it's actually that they prefer less qualified people because then they can pay them less. You got some sort of fly there bugging you.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, for the people watching the video, I'm not going crazy. There's just this fly that keeps.
I'm talking about for like adjuncts, when people in New York will die for any position at NYU. So even adjuncting is fine for them. Adjuncting is part-time, temporary, and you get paid much less, and there's the benefits are shaky. Let's put it that way. They would hire they hired, for example, a BA from off the street, in effect. They may as well have put a stand outside and said, anybody want a job at NYU? And they hired somebody that had no credentials at all and passed over hundreds of people coming out of Stanford and other Ivies and things like that. Just craziness.
Yeah. So you started an anonymous Twitter account, and that was originally how you vented and commented on this stuff.
Anti-PC NYU Prof.
Okay.
And I started tweeting criticism of all this. And
what was it? I'm just curious. Was it like your take on the country as a whole, or was it like specific? Like today on campus, I saw this.
Yeah, the stories were pouring in from all over the country about all this, like the safe spaces, the bias reporting hotlines. Which, if your listeners don't know, is like when they actually set up these hotlines, and now they're in like 260 universities, where you can report somebody's bias infraction to this bias response team, and they adjudicate these infractions behind closed doors, and who knows what happens. But so it's kind of like a stock.
Well, I'm sure there's a fair and equitable hearing, right?
Oh yeah, it's crazy. So. To me, it made the whole place the chilling effect was ridiculous.
Right, right.
They're advertising this all over the place, and they never even once defined any of the terms like bias infraction, microaggression. I mean, they just said there's this bias hotline. If you spot a bias, call this line or email this thing. And soon enough, they were creating apps in different universities where at Harvard, you just open your phone, click on the app, and report the bias, and there you go. So I thought this stuff was, and of course, the no platforming, like the driving speakers out. I was just criticizing all this stuff.
Okay.
The Halloween costume business where.
Sure, right. Appropriation.
You could change your gender. Wait a minute. Let me get this straight. You can change your gender from here between now and tomorrow, and you got to be called that in the classroom. But you can't wear a Halloween costume for one night. You change your identity entirely, but you can't wear a Halloween costume that might offend somebody. So it just all the craziness, and they were taking down dioramas with gorillas because they were too masculinist, and this was just beginning in 2016. Now, at this point, it's off the rails.
Sure. So again, I know you've had to tell this story several times, so I'll keep it short here, but just for the listeners who don't know the background. So then a student somehow tracked you down?
I create this Twitter account.
Right.
This student reporter tracks me down, says, are you really, I was anonymous at this point, are you really an NYU prof? I said, yes. Oh, this is interesting. Do you want to be interviewed? And I said, I'll talk to you. I'm not sure I'll go on the record. And I talked to her. I thought what I said was fine. I may have dropped an F-bomb here and there. But otherwise, what I said was actually I was still talking from the left.
Right.
I was still criticizing all this from a Marxist standpoint. And I was saying it divides the working class. It's about identity these identities are no politics to organize around. It's craziness and things like that.
Well, that's interesting. So that if you could spend a moment on that, so that we along the lines of how are, white and black and homosexual, heterosexual workers all supposed to rise up against their common enemy, the capitalists?
Right.
They want us divided like this.
Especially when you're dividing them against each other.
Right.
And privileging some, and then, basically demonizing others. A lot of demonization, just, the inexpiable sin, original sin of whiteness, the one you can't there's no redemption for.
Right.
That you're doomed for life. So yeah, things like that. And I even said in the interview, I'm a communist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying all this as a communist. That didn't help.
Right.
So within 2 days, I was called into the dean's office.
Because just for so you had gone in thinking you might be anonymous, but then you told her, go ahead and publish my name.
I let her publish it, with my name. She shot a picture. She had a photo of me, and I was laughing in the picture. Which was really a double heresy. I was like, I was just scoffing at them, right?
Right.
And so it ran, and within 2 days of that interview running, I was in the dean's office with the head of human resources, and they were strong-arming me to take a leave of absence. And then while I was in that interview, I didn't know this, but there was also a letter from a committee published, an open letter denouncing me, in which they called me guilty for my thoughts, literally. Yeah. So I was, accused of wrong thing. And the dean tried to accuse me of being insane. Like, you must, you need a break. People are worried about you. And things like this.
Yeah.
So I'm worried about them, frankly.
Right. Can I ask you, how long had you been doing that account, and running it anonymously before the reporter tracked you?
Months, maybe. Maybe even it was this came out in October, so it was like maybe a month and maybe 5 weeks roughly.
Do you know, was the account per se that big a deal? Did you hear people talking about it?
After the interview, it became a big deal, and they started. You know how they do? They go riffling through your tweets,
right. Okay,
and finding some egregious thing. One tweet was probably the furthest I pushed the envelope. Just to be real open about it, I said that I can imagine. This was when Trump was emerging, as the leading candidate. In fact, he was nominated, and I said, imagine the social justice warriors in their dormitories ready to jump out the window. And I said, let's only hope. And that was used as a endorsement of suicide.
Right.
And it was totally a joke. I had no student followers at this time. They pointed out the tweet to the students. They never would have seen it without them pointing it out.
Right.
So they were more guilty of encouraging suicide than I was.
Right. Yeah.
I was making a joke.
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody would know
and ask, and for the listener to get a flavor of. So that was like the most provocative thing you did. So right. Okay. And so then, what was interesting is they didn't fire you or,
No, they didn't fire me. And I was up for promotion to full professor at this time. And the whole thing rested on these administrators. Despite they had a committee formed to evaluate the candidates, but I had no idea what was going on. It was 6 months in waiting. And I got the impression that if I didn't take the leave of absence, not only might I lose my chances to be promoted to full professor, I might lose my job.
Right.
So the leave was I was really strongly pressured into taking it. Totally their idea. They came up with this idea, we'll get them off campus like this.
Right. Just kind of let things cool off and
something like that.
So then you did come back then, and you were not welcomed with open arms.
No, I was shunned by 100 faculty members.
And I want to stress this because people hear that and they think it might mean one thing. Is it literally true that they wouldn't get on an elevator with you?
Yes. Wouldn't get on an elevator, wouldn't let me on it with them either.
No, I hadn't heard that part. What does that mean? The door's open and you went to step in?
Here. Do not come in here. You'll violate my personal space if you come in here.
Really?
I will report you if you come in here. Yes. So, they tried to, they just made me a total pariah. They acted like I was some sort of in danger to their well-being.
Right, like you had a communicable disease or something.
Right.
So that is more information, because what I was going to ask you back when I assumed what it meant was if they saw you on the elevator, they were like, yeah, I'll catch the next one. Thanks.
No. I was
what I thought it was just that somebody would be afraid to be seen with you because then people might think
me to get on the elevator.
I see. Okay.
And then they moved my office to the Russian department. after this, I was assailed in this email list, official email list, where they called me every name you can imagine. Nazi, alt-right, racist, sexist, white, short pants, white devil, all kind of crazy shit, all in capital letters, screaming. And I never responded in kind at all. I just said, this is typical for the mob,
right?
And things like that, to mob on, blah blah blah. I mean, so instead of chastising or punishing those people that did this, they moved me to the Russian department in, I call it my personal gulag.
Right.
Because they put me in this room with metal shelves and no books. They wouldn't move my books.
Yeah, that's something I read in the book that I hadn't heard in previous. So your original office, you have all your books there. They relocate you.
There was a lot of books, and
right.
I couldn't carry them. It was like a mile. This NYU is very spread out, as you know.
Right.
The other office was like a mile away. I couldn't get them over there.
Right. So normally they'd put in a work order, and some guys would come and box it up and move it over.
Yeah, box it up, bring it over. Not only that, I had no support staff, no secretarial staff, no copier machine, nothing. Not that I use a copier, but I mean, I might have.
Right.
It's a basic total isolation. They were trying to totally isolate me on campus.
And were you teaching classes?
Yeah, I taught classes, but I couldn't go to do any committee work. For those who don't know, there's basically three parts to an academic job. You teach, you do service, which is committees and things like that, and you publish. So I was doing two of them, but I couldn't do any service work because no one would be on a committee with me, nor would they be in a committee on which I was on. They would quit.
And I wondered, I was going to ask you, did you notice a change in the attendance in your classes?
No, not at all.
Or not attendance, I meant enrollment.
No, in fact, my enrollment never went down. In fact, my enrollment would sell out, as I might say, within minutes of the classes going live where you could enroll. And so I would get requests from students all the time. Can I get in your class? Can you add me in anyway, even though it's over the limit?
Right.
Things like that.
Before this happened, you were saying you were a popular teacher.
And after.
Right, but I'm saying the baseline. It's not that this made you popular.
Yeah, in fact, if anything, it went up.
Okay.
Some of them were like, I want to know what this guy's about.
Right, because he had heard
this
you.
Might be interesting.
Yeah, right, yeah. So he might be like Sam Kinison in Back to School. So are you... I'm curious, and try to understand what seems to us, obviously, is this ludicrous response to what your alleged offense was.
Yeah.
Is it possible that a lot of them heard things that you had done or said that weren't true and just...
Oh, they made up things. Yeah, they made all these things up. They never said anything explicit. They just called me names.
But you see what I'm saying? Maybe the people who were shunning you, maybe they'd heard through the grapevine.
Yes, what had happened, it was kind of a herd response, right? So they knew that once a few provocateurs vilified me, everybody thought, well, we better do the same or else, maybe we'll be counted among them.
Right.
So it became just, it's very much of a groupthink response.
Okay. But also could be supplemented with if they had heard specific things
slurs
that weren't true, but thinking, wow, that guy really is a monster. Do you know he said he wished all his students would kill themselves? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, things like that. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Okay. If one of the things I liked in your book was you have this chapter on why corporations are so woke.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting, I can't remember his exact terminology, but I was watching one time this interview with Jordan Peterson, and they were, he was like a panel discussion or something. It was very friendly, like everybody. Yeah. And they were talking about these issues about, wow, these modern postmodernists, they reject logic and science. And And Peterson, again, this is not an exact quote, but he said something like, they know exactly what they're doing. Okay. What he meant was these other people were kind of rolling their eyes and chuckling at these morons. And he said, no, you're misunderstanding. And so that's what I liked about your corporation thing. I think a lot of us, in the libertarian camp, when the corporations, had these goofy commercials that are just, appealing to the leftist buzzwords. We just think, oh, they're just foolishly chasing, clients or customers, and they're those fools. They don't know what they're doing.
Exactly.
And that's not what you say.
Just placating the lefts. Hopefully they don't get canceled. Hopefully, they assuage a few people, and please their customer base plus word off activists, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I don't think that's I find that explanation is not sufficient.
Okay,
it's interesting, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah. What's your story?
Well, my take is that that woke capitalism is the expression of corporate socialism, and that it actually helps them to establish. It works as part of a monopoly scheme. It's part of their whole idea to destroy other competitors, to get rid of competitors. Now, there's a lot of connections that I have to make to make that clear. I don't know if you want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to, I'd love to hear you elaborate.
Well,
on
everything
that.
About the left, all the prongs of leftism match up with the globalist corporate interests of monopolistic corporations. For example, they're anti-nativist. The left. Let's just take the left. Some of their contemporary views. They're anti-nativist. They're pro, polygenderism and transgenderism, and all. They're anti-family. You saw this with Black Lives Matter. They came out and denounced the family. They're pro-immigration to the point where anybody can come here at any time.
Like open borders,
total open borders. Well, this happens to line up pretty well with the interests of these global corporations. It actually suits them just fine. And then if you look at the lockdown, for example, and the riots combined, I mean, what has it done but destroyed what? So far, they're saying 7.5 million small businesses will never reopen. 50% of small businesses are going to be wiped out. This was projected by the FEE, by the what's FEE stand for? I forget.
Foundation for Economic Education.
Yeah, that's right. They basically projected this out. So it looks like it just so happens that their interests line up with the left pretty well. So I call it corporate leftism. Now, this is not anti-free market. This is, what I'm talking about is kind of collusion between the state and these corporations. And their expression of woke capitalism is not merely some sort of placating PR routine. It actually serves their interest directly.
Okay, so I'm looking here at your bullet points. I think the only one you didn't say there is globalism, or in Marx's terms, internationalism.
Internationalism, right? Yeah. That's what Marxism is international.
Okay, so let me just go through this. So clearly, I think it's straightforward how a global multinational corporation would be for globalism. Unrestricted immigration because they get cheap labor,
right?
And so that's fine. The last two, I'm not saying I disagree, but can you say more on? It's not obvious to me at first glance why would major corporations who just want to make money care? How does it help them to promote transgenderism and getting rid of the family?
These are markets.
Okay.
This is a huge market in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, transgenderism. There's a huge market for these transitioning drugs and for surgeons and plastic surgeons. And so all of this feeds into one of the major sectors, the pharmaceutical and medical industry. So these are niche markets that they welcome. These are bigger markets than you might think. I mean, there's a huge increase in this transgender identification. I mean, if I say it's epidemic, it sounds like a disease, but it's enormous. Let's put it that way. And I glanced through a book that said basically people, young adults who would otherwise identify with having anxiety, depression, and other types of ailments are now basically suggesting that they're transgender. So it's become a sort of default position to take for any psychological disturbance at all. All right, I'm just turning off my AC so the fan doesn't make noise.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering what that was, but yeah, great. Okay, so that's very interesting, and I love those types of explanations, that because you're right, like on the surface of it, to just say, oh, they're, and there was some superficial plausibility. Like, hey, if you got this 5% of your customers who are going to flip out and organize boycotts, if you cross them, and the other ones won't.
But I'm not saying that's not a factor. I'm just saying it's not sufficient. It's certainly a factor, but it doesn't explain everything. And the other thing it doesn't explain is how the promotion of these ideas actually might hurt them in the long run. But it doesn't. So,
well, and I was going to ask, isn't there a notion in Marxism about like we'll give them the rope with which they hang themselves? So I'm wondering, like, do a lot of these corporations, they think they're going to be able to stop short, but not realize
capitalists sell us the rope with which we'll hang them.
Yeah.
And so the left believes, but first of all, the left is very pro-monopoly, whether they say so or not. Why? Because they want to make it quite simple to locate the major, consolidation of capital. So if you have it consolidated easily in monopolies, then it's easier to expropriate it, to take it back. Marx thought that monopolization was an inevitable function of capitalism, and that it eventually, you would have monopolization, period, and it was inexorable. It had to go that way. So, for example, I just read an article in the Jacobin, which is a democratic socialist organ, and they denounce small business, and they say they're, promoting small business is a bad idea because big corporations pay more, and they're more amenable to unions, and so they actually favor monopolization, strangely.
Okay, so
it serves the corporates. The left serves the corporates, and the corporates serves the left.
Right.
Which is very, that's a lot of people will be like, yeah, that's obvious, but it's not obvious to the left.
Right. No, it's not obvious to at least young right wingers as well, because I remember like Ayn Rand has this essay, I think it's an essay where she says like big business is America's most persecuted minority. And at first, like, you understand what she means, but the more you think about it, like, no, actually big business is not. They, there's all kinds of regulations, right? Where they, things like just, like after the accounting scandals in the early 2000s, and they passed Sarbanes-Oxley, like big companies were all for that because they have teams of accountants. It's easy for them to comply with that stuff, whereas it's the middle people.
And regulations are beneficial to them. So because the cost of entry becomes so much higher. So, regulation serves corporate monopolization. Or I'm not talking about, de facto monopolies. I'm talking about a tendency towards monopoly.
Right. And also, like, I think some of the real wealthy families, when the income tax was pushed through, like they were for a graduated income tax, because if you've already made your wealth and you're, going to pass it on to your kids and you control an industry, a very cripplingly high income tax is the way to kneecap any competitors to ensure your dominance.
So I got this idea. I might be real honest about it. Is reading Anthony Sutton and his trilogy on all this. Anthony B. Sutton, he wrote 3 books dealing with this strange animal called corporate socialism. And he noted that, and I think he's right, that they funded the Bolshevik Revolution. They were behind FDR, and they were also funding Nazis. So in all cases, they were funding either progressivism or socialism. So how do you explain that?
Right.
And he explained it by virtue of the fact that what socialism has in common with monopolization is they're both monopolies.
Mm-hmm. Right. Can you, since you just brought it up, would you mind, because again, for people who never heard this stuff, that this sounds like, crazy Alex Jones stuff.
It's not, because this is very empirically based.
Sure. Oh, I know that. Right. But so can you just speak a little bit about this funding of the Bolshevik Revolution and how?
Yes. Okay. There's some shall we say, evidence that Trotsky, for example, when he came to New York, which he did, that he left with a pile of money, and that money was possibly delivered by what Sutton would call corporate socialists. And so there was a lot of, and then Lenin also had a shipment of gold sent to him. There was plenty of evidence that bankers in not only the United States, and by the way, not just Jewish bankers, I want to make this clear. It was from England, Germany, and the United States. They crossed all ethnicities, not all ethnicities, but they weren't Jewish. Okay, so I'm not promoting some sort of Jewish conspiracy thing.
Right.
But the Rockefellers were involved, and others. And so they basically sent a lot of money to the Bolsheviks to fund their enterprise, without which they would have gotten nowhere.
Now, I'm trying to remember, was the immediate aim because they wanted to help
But they
Germany?
wanted was a captive market.
Okay.
That is, they wanted to sort of have an amalgam between state socialism and corporate monopoly in that state, so that they would handle some industries. And they did. They ended up pulling out a lot of resources, natural resources, mining, wood, things like that. They got monopolies over certain raw materials. They never did set up their, monopolies within it, but they worked to. They may have been a bad gamble in that case, but they did try.
Okay. So at least for the groups you're talking about, it didn't have anything directly to do with World War I. Like the issue wasn't we got to take Russia out of the war. This was more something that would have happened independent. No. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't about the war. Although there was some of the sport can be explained with reference to the anti-Tsarist sentiment among Jews, Jewish businessmen in the United States, that the Tsar was persecuting Jews. So there was something to that.
Right.
There was persecution of Jewish people by the Tsar. So they thought, what could be worse? Could these Bolsheviks be better?
Okay.
In terms of that.
Okay. If we can pivot now, I wanted to have you speak a bit to this. So I'll go ahead and just read the quote and then have you expand. So from your book, again, the book, folks, that we're talking about is Beyond Woke. You say, wokeness is analogous to the Christian encounter of being saved. Like being saved, being woke involves redressing transgressions through repentance and reformation. And as the Christian is saved not by works, but into works, so the newly converted social justice believers are woke, not by works, but into woke works. So if you could at least explain the specifics of that, but then more generally, I do want to just talk to you about this, because a lot of people have noted the religious overtones or feel of a lot of these movements.
Yeah, there's a religiosity to it. There's the sense that when you become woke, you find out you've been a transgressor. You have sinned in attitude and small mannerisms and in speech and actions and negligence and just not being aware of how oppressed a certain group is, right? So there's this awakening to conscience of your sinfulness, which is very analogous to the awakening to sinfulness of being saved. The only difference is that under wokeness, there's no, as I said before, there's no ultimate forgiveness. There's no redemption, for the white person, for example. And critical white studies and critical race theory too, basically make it a really inescapable dilemma for a white person. You're just indicted, and the indictment is not. You can't do anything about it. So I think that this really explains a lot of the really strange behavior on the part of white advocates in Black Lives Matter and their violence, because when you're indicted like that, you're like pinned to the mat. It's like you're being cornered. So what are you going to do? You're going to thrash out. But if you thrash out at the people that pinned you, you're a racist. So you thrash out at other white people, so that you can vent your anger for this indictment on others.
Right. Now, does this, because of the religiosity of it?
Yeah.
Does that explain the hostility of the left towards Christianity, or is it much deeper than that?
It's a competitor. Yeah, it's a competing religious creed. Definitely.
Okay.
And it's one that seems to appeal to the other side, as it were.
Okay. And let me ask you, and
of course, but there is a woke Christianity too. I mean, I shouldn't neglect to say that.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of because recently, just for the your background, Michael, because I had recently done a thing on why the left hates Christianity, and I was going through some of the obvious, things on the surface of the family stands in the way. Somebody who believes in God is willing to die for his beliefs. That kind of not the right sort of citizen that the left wants to follow their orders.
That's right.
But beyond that, I was getting into things like, if you think about postmodernism and deconstructing language and that sort of thing, well, Jesus is the logos. And so that seems
right.
like,
it's a patriarchal religion, right?
Right.
So it's all patriarchs. And even by admission, it's a patriarchal religion.
Right.
You have Abraham, Moses, Jesus. I mean, these are all patriarchs. So, and everything about Christianity, you have the supposed submission of the woman to the man in St. Paul. Mm-hmm. You have all these types of patriarchal edicts and so forth, that God is a man also. He's a patriarch. So, there's patriarchal.
But on that, where I was thinking though is those sorts of things would also be true for Islam, and yet the left is very tolerant of Islam.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's a very strange issue, and I think there's two factors that explain it. One is cultural relativism, which is rife in anthropology and sociology, but mostly comes out of anthropology, and that is you can't judge another's culture and their values, because doing so is a form of ethnocentrism, and is a pretext for cultural imperialism. So you can't negatively assess a culture that's other than your own. You have no standpoint from which to do it. And then the second factor is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Since Islam hates the West and imperialism and capitalism and the white man and all that, he's our buddy because we hate the same people.
Okay, right. That makes sense. Okay. Well, now's a good time, I guess, to ask, because you touched on some of this stuff. I wanted to, as somebody who, came out of that worldview, it's, in other words, like it's hard for me to pass the Turing test of a postmodernist, Marxist, what have you, since I
could fake it. I could definitely.
So I could try to be, could try to be fair, but I really don't know how they think. So there's certain things where, to an outsider at least, it looks like there's an obvious contradiction, and I'm wondering if you can. So you just mentioned one, like cultural relativism. It seems like you're not allowed to criticize any culture except European.
Your own, yes.
Right. So is that European. Is there a contradiction there, or does it actually make sense?
Because they say all cultures, no culture is better than any other, but the Western culture is particularly evil. So that's a definite contradiction. So we have to have a relativism with reference to cultures. None is better than the other, but the West is the worst.
Now, so I guess one way of me asking it, do you remember back when you were a true believer? Did that possible tension ever occur to you? And how would you have resolved it? Do you have any idea?
Well, I didn't resolve it. I know how I resolve it now, but yeah.
Okay.
Human rights are individually based. They can't be otherwise.
Sure. Okay, but at the time, had something like that occurred to you, like any of those contradictions, or was that not really?
Not really, because I was dealing in, so I was intoxicated with the high level theorizing and not so much the practical politics yet.
Right, and you alluded to another seeming contradiction, or at least tension, earlier in this discussion. We talked about the Halloween costume. That on the one hand, it's like the ultimate expression of individuality, to the point where, outsiders aren't even allowed to put labels on you. Like but yet, if you want to express your individuality by putting on, dressing up like a Native American.
If you wanted to dress up as a woman now, as a white man or any man, that would be totally verboten, because it's an attack on transgenderism. But you could become a woman tomorrow or tonight, for that matter. Yeah.
Okay, so there, is that the distinction? Like, again, I know we might disagree with the whole thing, but I'm trying to say,
one is suffering and the other's not. One is just enjoying it, and the other is suffering over it. So there's got to be a modicum of subordination and suffering involved to be celebrated by the left. Everything has to be the sufferer. Nietzsche talked about all this very well. This is very similar to their to resentment ideology.
But where does the suffering emanate from? From the fact that you were born in the wrong thing and so you were mislabeled?
Yes.
Okay. So that's why even a woman...
society doesn't accept you as such.
Okay. So that's even why a trans man is still celebrated, even though is becoming moving from the less dominated into the dominated to the dominant.
Yes,
still okay.
Even that's celebrated because you're trapped in the wrong body, which is already a form of suffering, and then you are then ridiculed, they say, by the wider culture. But you're not allowed to be, so I don't see where the ridicule is, but yeah.
Okay, so here's another one that I'm curious if you can shed some light on this and whether you think it's just a total contradiction or like, no, given the way they think, it actually kind of makes sense, is you're allowed to change genders, things like this. There's even stuff where, if you think you're a squirrel, you can be a squirrel. Quite literally. I'm not like people might think I'm making fun of it.
There's the furry movement, and there's there's all kinds of stuff.
But my understanding is if you are born white, you are not allowed to say I am black.
That's correct.
Like identify. So
Rachel Dolezal, or whatever her name is, Rachel Dolezal, she couldn't become black. Was not allowed because that's a transgression. And that is a contradiction. In fact, this came out in Hypatia, philosophical journal, when a assistant professor of philosophy challenged this contradiction. She was destroyed.
Now, was she doing it from within? Like she was sympathetic and just
from within and saying, I don't really see why there's a distinction between transgenderism and transracialism. They're the same sort of change. They're the same sort of move. It's the same sort of crossing over identity boundaries. And especially in the case of a man becoming a woman, it's moving to a subordinated status voluntarily. So it was totally, she got lambasted by the feminists. They called her a TERF. That's a trans exclusionary radical feminist. That's like once you get that label, you're ruined.
Right. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts is. One thing that occurs to me as to why that happened is just, at least in U.S. politics, I can't speak for the rest of the world, like with the civil rights movement, there's such vested interest in political power associated with like anti-racism and whatnot that you just can't let outsiders walk in and become black.
Yeah, but even that doesn't work because there's a huge amount of political power invested in feminism too. And yet they let men into feminism, or what were men. And you have basically people with penises running feminism now. I mean, that's that simple. So you want to talk about the patriarchy taking over? They have, just in disguise, if you will.
Okay, so then what? And I hear what you're saying. And so what? And there is like a mild backlash of, especially like in sports.
Yes, there is some backlash.
Yeah. But even there, it's very
we're
tepid.
We're not having it. Yeah, we're not having it. That's enough. And we're not going to have you in our spaces. We're not going to have you taking over our sports. We're not going to have you in our bathrooms. We're they're denigrated by the broader culture.
Right. But you are correct that there it's more of there was just for the lack of better term, invasion and then a counterattack, whereas right at the gates of who's the black community, they're saying, no, you're not coming in here.
You can't do this.
And so I'm wondering, what is
they made up all kinds of vague and ridiculous notions, but mostly it's just slur. They just slur you with a label and that's it. They don't really, so there's a lot of disingenuous rationalizations for what they do. And I don't follow it because it's so absurd.
But my question is why... Forget whether the rationalizations are plausible or not, but I'm just is a phenomenon that intrigues me. Why did it happen there but nowhere else?
It's really hard to say. I guess it's because blacks are more subordinate, possibly, because it's a category engendered with a great deal of political power as a subordinate group, probably. And you can't have their lived experience. That's the big key, lived experience. But I don't know how. I guess when you're transgender and you're male, you're actually having the lived experience of a woman without being one, ostensibly. So I guess that's the distinction they would draw.
Okay.
Lived experience is everything in critical race theory and all that. That's why no matter what you say, it can't be right because you don't have the lived experience of those who are in that category. So therefore, everything you say, even if it's logical, is racist.
Okay, so
you want an example?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so let's say there was critical race theory. One of the inaugural texts in critical race theory was a complaint that black dolls were cheaper than white dolls. Okay, now if you pointed out that actually the fact that black dolls were cheaper than white dolls was actually an advantage for black consumers that was based on their lower buying power, that it was a way of equalizing their wages with their consumer power, they'll just say that's a racist statement.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's logical, it's racist and they're right because of their lived experience. And so let's say the black doll was actually more expensive. They're still going to find a way to complain about it.
Oh, and I know they will, because the fact that women's haircuts cost more is proof of sexism.
Yes.
They always use those.
Whether you're paying more or less or the same, I guarantee you they'll find a way to make it a problem.
Right. So let me just make sure.
There's a reason why they do this, by the way. See, it's only explicable if the hierarchy is being reversed. The whole thing is an inversion ideology. Why would people rush to more subordinated status? Why? Why would they demand to be more subordinate than others? It's because the social justice ideology flips the hierarchy on its head.
Mm-hmm.
It's an inversion ideology. And so being at the bottom, it means being at the top.
Right. Let me just paraphrase what you said a minute ago just to make sure the listeners got it and that I understood you correctly. So you're saying, to the extent that we do want to come up with, a plausible reason for why on the left, with celebrating transgenderism and you just your own identity, but saying, no, if you were born white, you don't just get to decide I'm going to identify as black. Right. Because you haven't grown up being called the N-word and so forth. The cops, it's a visible thing. Whatever you think you are in your head, if you have white skin, the cops aren't going to beat you up and whatnot.
Privilege. So
okay, and so that's why they're saying you don't get to be one of us and then get the compensations and so forth and the sympathy that we've built up over the decades,
which is itself a benefit. So
okay, right.
If it weren't a benefit, they wouldn't be guarding the territory so closely.
Okay. All right. So that makes sense. I can see that. All right.
I mean, how else can you understand it? I mean, of course, that's racist to say. So.
Right. Let's see here. I did want to. I don't want to run out of time on this, so I do want to pivot to. As you know, because we communicated beforehand, I recently had there's this guy Thaddeus Russell. And I had a debate with him. And so let me first explain what his take is. There's two issues in here, like postmodernism and Marxism, and then also postmodernism as a foundation for liberty. So first, let me take the Marxism one. So what Thaddeus says is, just looking at the actual definitions and what they are conceptually, postmodernism rejects meta-narratives.
Right.
That encourages humility in terms of what can we possibly know about things.
Yes.
Whereas Marxism is a meta-narrative.
Yeah.
And, it tells us quite explicitly, here's how history advances. There's going to be capitalism, then it's going to burst asunder and lead, Okay, so Thaddeus is saying, guys like Jordan Peterson talking about postmodernist cultural Marxists, that's like a contradiction in terms. What an idiot. So how do you feel about that?
That's wrong. It's wrong. Because, okay, there's a couple explanations. I'll give Stephen Hicks's explanation in his book explaining the postmodernism. Mm-hmm. He says the epistemological relativism and subjectivism are mere screens or they're mere covers for the absolutism underlying their actual MO. That while they pretend to be relativistic and subjectivistic, they're actually absolutist at base, and that they're pushing an absolutism under a cover. Now, I think it's slightly different. I explain it slightly differently. When you have an anything goes epistemology, then a given one can be, an arbitrary one can be imposed, okay, with authority, because you have no object world that can push back against it, because the object world doesn't matter. It's your subjective beliefs that count. When belief is asserted as authoritative on its own, then you can assert anything with authority that has to believe, whether it has any basis in any empirical evidence or not. And that's exactly what's happened with transgenderism, for example. There's no empirical basis that for transgenderism in terms of chromosomes. For the most part, there may be anomalies, but there's XXYs and XYYs are very rare. So you have belief being enforced, so that now in the university, for example, if you don't believe that there may be 48 or 72 genders, you're in deep shit. So this becomes imposed with authority and force, or the threat of force. And despite the so-called willy-nilly anything goes idea of postmodernism, it leaves open the imposition, when there's power in hand, for forcing beliefs, for forcing acceptance of beliefs based on their assertion alone.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one example of, I don't know if this is exactly what you mean, but I noticed when I was doing research on this stuff that I believe Jacques Derrida and Foucault both signed a petition to get rid of age of consent laws in France, because there were some people that were, sleeping with like a 13-year-olds or something. And I think the idea was, hey, who are we to judge whether the relationships were consensual, and who are we to second guess? But yet they didn't sign a petition to get rid of minimum wage laws, saying who are we to judge whether the worker, if they consented to it, is being exploited or not. And so it does seem like an inconsistency. Like
not only that, I mean, Derrida explicitly stated that his whole deconstructive the whole project of deconstruction was motivated, if not, it wasn't explicitly Marxist, but it was motivated by Marxian theorists, Marxian belief. Mm-hmm. And that is, he was trying to destroy power structures using the deconstruction of language as the new means to do so. But it's Marxist at base, in the sense that the underlying ethos is Marxist. There's this attempt, and same with Foucault with his analyses of power. He more or less stood Nietzsche on his head. That is, Nietzsche's will to power is the motive force of being. Mm-hmm. It's what motivates everybody. But Foucault took power as the operating principle of society, but doesn't argue for its embrace, but rather the opposition of against the more powerful, but using power to do so. Okay, so what they do is they assume that operative mode, and then oppose the dominant. That's the whole scheme, all the way through all postmodernism. Underlying it all is a Marxist premise. Absolutely, they broke with Marxism, but it's Marxism they broke with, and that is important. It's like if you stand, like they say, Marx stood Hegel on his head. Okay, that means he took Hegel's body, or his body of thought, and he flipped it on its head. But it's Hegel he flipped on its head. It's not something else. So it still has the characteristics of what you inferred.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So the same is true for postmodernism in terms of Marxism.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And so so number one, guys like Jordan Peterson, they're not crazy for seeing this connection, this association.
No, I'm preparing a course on critical theory, which is the Frankfurt School, cultural studies, and postmodern theory to explain cultural Marxism. They're all part of it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You can't exclude postmodern theory from cultural Marxism. It is cultural Marxism.
Okay, great. So it's not really that they happen to go hand in hand. You're saying there's a deeper affinity.
There's a deep affiliation. There's a deep. They're cognates. One is impressed by the other. Postmodernism has the both birthmarks of Marxism all over it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, and even your answer to this, the first one, still kind of spills over in the second. So again, the thing I was debating Thad with was he claims postmodernism. Actually, I don't know why libertarians run from it. Look at you. There's a potent set of tools here by which we can limit the state. All those scientific claims.
First of all, postmodernists don't see all power in the state at all. Foucault, for example, Michel Foucault, he saw power as diffuse, disembodied, everywhere, in all circumstances, every kind of encounter, there's a power relation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so everything comes down to power, but it's not in the state as such. It's everywhere. Power it's like a broadcast of waves going out all over space. Power is diffuse. It has no central location. So the opposition to the state is not at all at hand. That's not what they're about. In fact, they're statists all the way.
Okay.
Because they want to impose their particular standards on everybody. And so the only way to do that is through the state. If you read Lyotard, the guy whose book Postmodern Condition is the book from which postmodernism is named, his biggest concern was that the state was losing power to corporations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay.
And the idea that it's because it gives you these tools to oppose things is not true, because what it does is it looks like it's anything goes. Like there's epistemic humility, but when it comes down to what it comes down to is just the ability to say anything goes, and what we say goes.
Well, yeah. So that's what I was going to ask you, because you said a minute ago that they're going to want the power to input their status through because they want to impose their views on others. These words to that effect. And again, just it seems prima facie that's like, if your whole worldview is we can't be sure of any, I don't even know if I exist. Right. You would think that would make you very hesitant and careful before pointing guns at people.
Here's how Hicks puts it, and I think he's right about this. If it were the case that this skepticism were the main issue, if that were the main direction that we're going, then you'd have postmodernists of all kinds of political persuasions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they wouldn't just gravitate towards leftism, right? But they're all leftists,
right?
Okay, they're all hardcore leftists. So it shows you that what leads is the skepticism is a disguise or a mechanism, a means. I think it's not just a disguise; it's a means for authoritarianism,
right?
And let me just talk about like where it came from. Why did they develop? They developed because Marxism failed. That's the main reason that postmodernism develops. The master narrative didn't work, yet they have to retain their leftism at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so leftism is a long series of digging ourselves in a hole based on an imaginary reality and then digging ourselves out of it. I mean, that's really what leftism is. It's a long series of erecting imaginary foes, okay?
Right.
Then finding our way out of this predicament that we've actually created ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is interesting. And also with the cultural Marxism, by the way, for people who don't know what that is, can you just briefly define what is the term cultural Marxism?
Cultural Marxism is revolution by another means. So the idea that the worker would rise up as a collective and organized, would notice their immiseration, their poverty, their oppression, their exploitation, especially.
Mm-hmm.
They would collect, they would internationalize, and they would overthrow capitalism. Well, it didn't happen. So they started to theorize, well, maybe it's because we need to change the workers' consciousness first. So we need to penetrate all the institutions that propagate capitalist ideology, like the state, like the media, and all that. So it was a way. So Gronsky called it a long march through the institutions to create socialist ideological hegemony and counter-capitalist ideological hegemony. That's called Marxism.
Okay, and for people who haven't heard that, that's why it's like. So my background, Michael, I started out, I was like a right-winger, liked Rush Limbaugh kind of thing. Then I was like conservative, then I became libertarian. And so it back when I was younger and I knew what in my view, the correct economic policy views were and things like this, it just seemed like, man, this is a coincidence. It seems like whether it's environmentalism or sex education in the schools or whether it's foreign policy, like all these different issues, it's always a bigger state. What a coincidence that on all these different things that people who just want to help the environment happen to be wrong. And so then reading, about Gromsky and these things, realizing that no, it's not a coincidence. There's literally a strategy saying this is how we will advance socialism by taking over all these other institutions and going, that way. So, and Marcuse, the Frankfurt School theorist, said we must undertake ideological subversion. He said it's straight up in black and white. Okay, so and the postmodernists are doing it after the failure of socialism, and then the student rebellion in '68 also flopped. They didn't take over France, and de Gaulle stayed in power. So they were like, what's wrong? We need another approach. We can't abandon leftism. My God, it's our identity. It's our soul. Right. We can't leave it go. We have to find another way. So they created all these other means of opposition. Okay. Right.
This is a little bit heavy stuff. I hope it's not too much, but.
No, I know. This is exactly what I was hoping that you could talk about. And then, I think in your book, but also I saw you mention it, the talk you gave at the Mises Institute, this phrase "discursive violence." So can you speak, because I want to connect that to some things, but first, can you just tell us what does that mean?
Well, the deconstructionists, Derrida, in fact, said there is no outside of text. So basically, he said there's no outside of language. Language is it. There's no ontologies to which language points. They don't exist. Language is a self-referential system. Okay, there isn't an exterior to it. So the ontologies that you might point to are not out there. They're in the language only. So language becomes the means by which the world is constructed, according to them. It's linguistic constructivism. So once you give language this power to construct the world, now it has power to do violence as well. And so speaking itself becomes an act. They call it an act rather than sort of they don't differentiate between actions and speech. So therefore speech has to be policed. It has to be policed because it constitutes violence in itself in cases. So speaking against, they could construe anything because belief, as I said, is unconstrained by the material world. Anything can be construed as violent. Any speech, even espousing free market economics, is violent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for that. And then now here's what I want to do, and I hope I can get this across. Again, I was just thinking about the different elements of these cultural battles, and it seemed like there's a superficial tension. So I think I could resolve this, but I'm curious to get your take. On the one hand, it's like, some of these extreme leftists talking about, hey, if you misgender somebody, you don't use the right pronouns, you're literally committing violence against the person.
That's violence, yeah.
And like the sort of, regular everyday person response is like, guys, that's crazy. They're just words. Why are you taking it so seriously? Like you're being, drama queens about it or something. But yet on the other hand, the extreme postmodernists are saying words don't mean anything.
Right.
Or even like James Lindsay on Twitter arguing with people saying 2 + 2 could equal 5. And so again, like the normal sort of, Western rationalist response is to say, what are you talking about? Of course words mean something. And of course, 2 + 2 = 4. And I'm outraged. So do you see how it's weird? Like on the one hand, they give words.
Problem, but it's what arises when you dismiss any kind of correspondence theory between language and the objects, between what they call the signifier and the signified. Once you buy into that rupture, then basically language neither can describe the world, but on its own has the very power to make it. So it's one and the same.
Here, let me put it to you this way. So I like what you're saying, and I get that that's the solution. But let me just make sure that I want to make sure the listener at least gets why it's odd. It's like if words don't mean anything, or words can mean whatever you think they mean. When I call someone the wrong pronoun and the person says that's violence, can't I just say, oh, no. What I mean by Mr. is what you mean by Miss. You see what I'm saying? Like you're assuming there's this common meaning of these pronouns.
You're assuming that I'm a man. I never said I was a man.
Right.
I'm actually, what I am is I'm a pineapple tree. And so I can't possibly commit discursive violence against you. And I don't even know what you're talking about. When I say he, what I really mean is spaceship.
Right. Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Exactly right. You're assuming I was using a pronoun. That's a concept that you're getting from Shakespeare and imposing on me. What are you talking about?
What you're doing is you're basing the meaning on your socially constructed construal of what I'm saying.
Right. So you get how on the one hand it seems there's this tension that if words don't mean anything, how could they possibly hurt somebody?
Yeah, and the retort is exactly that. Yeah.
Okay, so again, what would their official position be? Like how would they reconcile?
Well, see, it becomes absolutist whenever they want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll pin meaning down when they want it to be pinned down, and they'll leave it slippery and completely disengaged when they want it to be disengaged. That's what I mean about the incipient authoritarianism that's underneath of it all.
Okay. But then in terms of connecting where they think they're coming from, is this true, just to summarize what you said a minute ago, that they're saying
words are real and they're the real reality, and so whatever words you use, that's making the real what it is.
Okay, right. Because you're like, if things are social construction, how people think about something is extremely important. Language helps frame your conceptualization.
It produces the reality in their minds.
Right. And so that's why policing words becomes so important, because that's okay. All right.
Yeah. And then you could look at deeper into like the Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse's essay, Repressive Tolerance. I won't get into it, but basically he says that only leftist expression is permissible because it's the emancipatory expression. Other expression is repressive and has to be repressed.
Right. Okay. The last thing I wanted to ask you was, so again, folks, I'm looking at his book, Beyond Woke. You quote here from Whittaker Chambers as to what is it that constitutes a true communist. Let me just read the little excerpt and then have you respond to it. So he goes through, you go through some superficial things, and that's not really the essence. And he says, rather,
it's not the essence. That's right.
I think these are your words, and you're just paraphrasing. Rather, a true communist is one who has examined a long historical and still presently dysfunctional world, probably more negatively than most, and has arrived at the conviction that its rational and total remaking is both necessary and possible.
Yeah.
And so for you, you're saying that's, and you're agreeing with Whittaker Chambers, that's what makes the communist.
Because there's people drop off different clauses of, so we say auxiliary clauses of Marxism, like the dictatorship of the proletariat, or even the labor theory of value. I'll have Marxists tell me that that's not important to them at all. They don't care about that. And exploitation, in a real strict denotive sense that Marx used it, is not important. They'll drop off auxiliary theses when they feel like it. So at the bottom of it is this idea that we can remake the world using our rationality. Now, postmodernism, of course, drops that part out too. But anyway, But
the world needs to be remade, because right now it's very bad.
It still needs to be remade, but necessarily through rationality. Yeah.
The postmodernist thing, but I'm saying for the communist, it's
they still have by mid-century there, and I think at base, whether they admit it or not, they're saying that that the rational person looks at the world and says this can't stand, and we have to use our rationality to change it. Indeed.
And that helps explain like why they want to tear down existing institutions that have produced this injustice that they see all around, and then replace it with something that they can construct.
I mean, today's movement is a mix of postmodernism and Marxism. I mean, it's so entangled that it would take a decade to try to undo it.
Right. Okay. Well, before we close, do you want to tell us about the new book you're working on that's forthcoming?
It's finished. It's
okay.
It's called The Thief. I'm sorry, it's not called The Thief. That was my short stories. It's called The Thought Criminal. Yes. So it's about a futuristic, but not so remotely futuristic scenario in which there is a what I call collective mind, and it's not just the collective groupthink. It's an actual technology that is used to import thoughts into the neocortex of the human race using nanobots. And this is all, by the way, being thought of now, that we'll be on the internet at all times. So, and it's the control the influx of inputs into the brain. And I said, and so at one point, this federation of pandemos, which is the state, a global state, uses a virus in order to connect people to collective mind. And so now it becomes involuntary, because supposedly viruses, of course, are communicable and they don't need consent. You don't have to consent to have a virus, right? In fact, usually wouldn't. So they perpetrate this virus, although they say that the virus is actually the cure. It's actually the disease. And so there's these thought deviationists who attempt to keep virus free using a drug that is actually addictive as well. So, so it isn't like there's an obvious obvious anti-pharmaceutical and anti big collective digital domination over us. There's a lot of paradoxes in it.
Sure. Okay, well, it sounds very interesting. Well, folks, for the links of all the things we've been talking about here, go to bobmurphyshow.com/145. My guest has been Michael Rectenwald. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.